The Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the Appalachian Trail form the backbone of the eastern portion of the U.S. National Park System. Together, they welcome 15 million visitors every year. But the process of creating them was harder than you might think. And that's because in the early 1900s,
many people had no idea what the Great Smoky Mountains looked like.
That is, until a pioneering photographer in North Carolina inspired the nation with his camera.
You can tell how much he loved these mountains by the way he photographed them. And he definitely wanted to share the experience of being in these places with his audience.
I'm Anissa Khalifa. This is The Broadside, where we tell stories from our home at the crossroads of the South. This week, how an immigrant from Japan became the eyes of the American conservation movement, and the dark secrets that motivated his life's work.
What can 160 years of experience teach you about the future? When it comes to protecting what matters, Pacific Life provides life insurance, retirement income, and employee benefits for people and businesses building a more confident tomorrow. Strategies rooted in strength and backed by experience. Ask a financial professional how Pacific Life can help you today. Pacific Life Insurance Company, Omaha, Nebraska, and in New York. Pacific Life and Annuity, Phoenix, Arizona.
Hi, I'm Paul Bonesteel, filmmaker in Asheville, North Carolina.
Paul specializes in documentaries, mostly set in his home in western North Carolina. During his career, he's moved across a broad range of topics, from a group of pioneering Black golfers in the 1960s to the life of literary giant Carl Sandburg. But one subject has consumed him for decades: a mysterious local figure known as George Masa.
A couple of journalists here in the Asheville area back in the late 90s were writing about him. Little bits and pieces were floating to the surface.
Here are the basics. George Masa was an immigrant from Japan. He moved to Asheville, where in the 1920s he became a prolific photographer of the Appalachian Mountains and an influential figure in the national parks movement, the Ansel Adams of the East. But there were so many gaps and unanswered questions, like where did he come from, and why did he settle in this place to begin with?
I wanted to know the background and the story in all of its, depth and complexity.
And Paul has done just that. He recently co-wrote a biography about Masa and has directed 2 films about his life. The first one came out in 2003, and the latest, called A Life Reimagined, the George Masa story, is due out in the spring of 2026. The new film documents the personal struggles and triumphs of the trailblazing photographer, and it uncovers some of the secrets of the man whose unlikely story in Asheville started in a humble way. When did George Masa first come to North Carolina, and what was he doing here?
Masa arrived to Asheville in 1915 in July and went to work at Grove Park Inn, the fanciest, newest hotel in Asheville, right? And so he started in the laundry room and was quickly, though, in the lobby working as a valet.
But soon enough, George was taking hotel guests on guided hikes into the Blue Ridge Mountains and taking their photographs.
He just was clearly motivated and self-taught for the most part, and I think just a very quick learner.
These early years spent as a guide suited him well. Although he never spoke about his past, George was curiously an expert mountain climber with extensive knowledge of the outdoors. He made friends easily and had an outgoing personality. But Paul suspects his gregarious nature was also motivated by something slightly darker: the tension caused by being an outsider in such a secluded place.
He needed to be friendly He needed to exude confidence, and he did so very well. But there was a lot going on, I think, in his dynamic. He was one of only a handful of Japanese people living in Asheville during that time. So it wasn't like, there was a community here that he could feel completely comfortable in.
And despite George's best efforts, that isolation was inescapable, and it occasionally made him a target.
Foreigners were under great suspicion. He was suspicioned to be a spy during World War I a couple of times. He was targeted by the Klan here in Asheville. They tried to essentially get him arrested and get him thrown out of town just because he was different.
But George persevered and kept studying the craft of photography. He worked briefly for another Asheville photographer before opening his own business, Plateau Studios, in 1920.
And for about 5 years as Plateau Studios, George Masa was running really the busiest photo studio in Asheville.
He became a fixture of the local community. He did private portraits, worked for the Chamber of Commerce, and was on the beat for both of the town's newspapers. But his real passion was the landscape photography that he took on long hikes in the wilderness. Masa was one of the first people to shoot photos in an area to the west of Asheville that was then being considered as the site of a new national park in the east.
And he started doing postcards of the area, and that led him into conservation work, which, wasn't even a term at the time. So all this was during really the decade where these ideas of national parks were coming into reality in the East. And photographs were very necessary. Many people were talking in Washington and in Raleigh and in Knoxville and in various places about a national park, but many people had no idea what the Great Smoky Mountains looked like.
So many people have taken pictures of these mountains, right? But can you describe what's special about George Masa's photos?
First off, at the time, obviously it was a lot more difficult to take these kinds of photographs. So you have to respect that right off the bat. Where he went to with the gear that he traveled with, that was phenomenal effort. But putting all that aside, aesthetically, one of the things that comes up in the film, and people have often commented over the years, he does have sort of a balance in his photography. Some people have called it this sort of Japanese aesthetic.
And that style caught the eye of many of the advocates for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Although it's now the most visited national park in the U.S., at the time, it was just an idea. The stretch of mountains on the Tennessee and North Carolina border was a wild tangle of land owned by the federal government, timber companies, and private citizens. In order to make the park a reality, that private land needed to be purchased, and the public needed to be convinced of the project's value. And to that end, conservation groups heavily used Masa's photos.
Public relations was huge in terms of even swaying the communities that were going to lose jobs because of the national park, right? They were going to lose homes. Communities were moved out of the parkland. So public relations was part of the effort. And Masa's photographs contributed greatly to just broadening that conversation.
Now well known for his work in the Smokies, George Masa and his longtime collaborator, the writer Horace Kephart, began working on another project gaining steam in the nearby mountains, the Appalachian Trail, which was still in the planning phase.
And the southern part needed boots on the ground, literally. There were ideas of where to take it, where to move from point A to point B, but they had not locked it down and they had not routed the trail. So Masa and Kephart and others in the Carolina Mountain Club and other hiking groups, they became the boots on the ground to route the trail. And again, there weren't really maps of these areas, not cove by cove, not ridge by ridge.
Although they were volunteers, Masa and his friends were in constant communication with the federal authorities planning the project. And along the way, he meticulously photographed, mapped, and named some of the most isolated areas of the wilderness.
And that formed the basis of the Appalachian Trail.
George Masa left behind a vast collection of images that inspired generations of Americans to support land conservation. And his work was foundational in the creation of two of the crown jewels in the national park system. But what about the mysterious past of the man behind the camera?
His friends really knew very little about his life in Japan and why he came here, and even his life before he came to Asheville. And now we know why.
Coming up after a short break, we crack the curious case of George Masa. We're living in an age of information overload, and that can be especially stressful during the holiday season. But Masterclass provides me with a type of learning that feels personal and specific. It allows me to focus on one thing I want to learn in each bite-sized lesson. One class I found inspiring recently was from former U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo on poetic thinking, all about opening yourself up to the creative process. And there's so much more. You can learn how to tell a great story from the legendary LeVar Burton, or apply the principles of improv to your life with Amy Poehler. With Masterclass, you can learn from the best to become your best, in a way that fits into your schedule. With audio mode, you can listen to Masterclass lessons anytime, anywhere. And the classes really make a difference. 83% of surveyed members say they've applied something they learned from Masterclass to their lives. Masterclass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes up to as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/broadside for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/broadside. masterclass.com/broadside.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
Late one day in June 1933, George Masa lay in bed in a sanitarium on the outskirts of Asheville, suffering from the flu and tuberculosis. He had been sick for weeks, but on this day, he asked a nurse to contact his close friend Barbara Ambler, who had hiked with him in the Carolina Mountain Club.
So he wanted to see her the day before he died and tell her something important.
But she didn't arrive until the next morning.
And when she got there, she found out he had passed. So she never got to hear what he wanted to tell her.
Barbara would regret not hearing his final words for the rest of her life. Because while she knew George well, there was so much left unsaid.
His friends really knew very little about his life in Japan and why he came here, and even his life before he came to Asheville.
And at first, neither did documentary filmmaker Paul Bonesteel.
Ultimately, we were left with what even his friends were left with after he died, which was a dead end in terms of why he was here and why he was fairly secretive about his backstory.
But after Paul's first film about George Masa's life aired on PBS North Carolina in 2003, he received a tantalizing clue.
A family called me afterwards and said, George Masa lived in my family's house until he moved to that sanitarium, and he left some papers there.
It took Paul 5 years to actually get his hands on these notes, but when he did, they were far from easy to decipher.
I had my Japanese translator and researcher here in Asheville translate them, and they were confusing, frankly.
The papers appeared to be drafts of letters from George Masa to people in Portland, Oregon, about a mutual friend named Yama who had recently died. But a lot was still unclear. Who was Yama? How had George Masa known him? Was Yama even a real person? All these were questions Paul didn't have time to chase. By this point, he had moved on to his next film. But around 2017, he was approached to work on a book about Masa's life with author Janet McHugh, and it renewed his interest in the project.
And with Janet's help and some grants from some research funding, we were able to hire some Japanese researchers, retranslate these letters, break them down and find the names of people in these letters and prove who these people were on the West Coast.
It was very interesting and very frustrating process, yes.
This is Mami Kikuchi, a Portland-based researcher who helped decode George Masa's notes. Mami is skilled in translating old primary sources, but she says the Yama letters presented two major problems. The first is a common one: legibility.
Handwriting, reading someone's handwriting is one challenge itself, but like reading someone's handwriting from 120 or 110 years ago is a huge challenge. And like many times we just couldn't decipher easily.
But the second issue was unique to the Japanese language itself. During the early 20th century, modernization swept the country. And with that push came major changes to the language.
The Japanese language in writing and speaking was like really different at the time.
Because of that, tackling the Yama letters was a time-consuming process. But as she began to cross-reference them with other archives from the time, looking for the people, places, and events they mentioned, a surprising and extremely complicated story began to emerge. Mami, Paul, and the rest of the research team were shocked to discover that George Masa had lived a whole other life with a completely different profession.
We find out that George Masa was a baseball player on the West Coast of the United States, in Seattle and Portland, on some of the earliest Japanese baseball teams in America.
Paul says the people he was sending the letters to were his former teammates. And the person, Yama, who George was writing about, was actually himself.
So he was writing to his friends saying, our mutual friend, Yama, who died, and you know the story about him on the West Coast, but there's a lot you don't know about him.
So why was George Masa writing to his old friends, pretending to be a stranger? Well, it likely had to do with a crime that occurred years before, when the baseball team traveled to a tournament in Japan. For reasons unknown, George stayed behind in Portland and got married. And during this time, a large sum of money that the team left in his care went missing.
It wasn't just missing. He described it as being tricked by some bankers in Seattle who were funding the team.
It's unclear if George or his new bride were guilty of stealing the money, but Paul thinks these letters to his old friends back in Portland were a way for him to try and clear his name without leaving a trail back to his new life in Asheville.
So he's basically telling his life story to his friends who never knew his true life story, all in an attempt to explain what had happened to this $1,500.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's fantastic. That's basically how we figured out that George Masa was this person. His true name, Shoji Endo, and his nickname was Yama.
Shoji Endo, a.k.a. George Masa, left Portland in 1915 under a cloud of scandal. And he parted ways with his wife at some point and came east, first to New Orleans and then to Asheville.
He commits suicide in a symbolic way. Shoji Endo never lives again, and he becomes a new person. His life in Western North Carolina and his photography and all the work he did after that, I think, and we think, is in some way connected to his desire to regain his honor and to prove himself and to focus his abilities and his passion to create a legacy.
This revelation about George Masa's real name also meant that for the first time, Paul could trace him back to his country of birth and find out about Masa's life before he came to America.
He was born in Tokyo. His mother died in childbirth, and his father remarried He was basically cast off by his birth father and adopted by a family member that lived in Shizuoka, down sort of south of Tokyo near Mount Fuji.
There, he learned to play baseball in the shadow of the iconic mountain peak. But Paul says he was mistreated by his adopted family.
So much so that he wanted to leave as soon as possible, and did as soon as he graduated from high school. We aren't aware that he ever had contact with them again.
And in another major revelation, the research team found evidence that explained how Shoji Endo became such a skilled mountaineer.
When he was in Tokyo, he actually joined the first climbing organization in Japan, the Japanese Alpine Club, and then came to the United States and joined a very prominent club in Portland called the Mazamas. He was the first Japanese member of that club.
In the Pacific Northwest, Shoji Endo's love for hiking would earn him the nickname Yama, which means mountain in Japanese. And when he crossed the country, symbolically dying and being reborn as George Masa, that love of mountains was the only thing he brought with him.
You know, in the big picture, what we've now learned is that mountains were always a thread in his life.
On the surface, George Masa simply came to Asheville, North Carolina in 1915 in response to a help wanted ad. But it's hard not to imagine that the job, at an inn nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, called to him in some way.
When you look at the photos even today, as someone says in the film, you can tell how much he loved these mountains by the way he photographed them. And he definitely wanted to share the experience of being in these places with his audience.
And that love, that mission that Masa devoted the last years of his life to, came full circle about 2 decades ago. A Japanese hiker's experience on the Appalachian Trail inspired a movement to establish the first formalized long trail in Japan. And here in George Masa's adopted country, whether people know his name or not, generations of Americans have hiked the Appalachian Trail and immersed themselves in the beauty of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Spending time in the mountains, going to the mountains, a pilgrimage of sorts or a long hike, it's just good for you. A lot of people, for generations, have enjoyed that, and Masa fits into that story in an intriguing way. His creativity and his interest in doing work for others, that's something that inspires people. It inspires me.
An honorable legacy that anyone would be proud of. Paul Bonesteel is the co-author of the biography George Masa, A Life Reimagined. He's also the director of a new documentary about Masa due out early next year. You can find out more information about the film and see many of George Masa's photos at georgemasa.com. This episode of The Broadside was produced by me, Anissa Khalifa, and our editor, Jared Walker. The rest of our team includes producer Charlie Shelton Ormond and executive producer Wilson Sayre. The Broadside is a production of WUNC North Carolina Public Radio and is part of the NPR network. If you have feedback or a story idea, you can email us at broadside@wunc.org. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a rating, a review, or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening, y'all. We'll be back next week.
This November, action is free on Pluto TV. Go on the run with Jack Reacher.
Every suspect was a train killer.
Then buckle up for Drive, World War Z,
Every human being we save is one less to fight.
and Charlie's Angels.
Damn, I hate to fly.
Launch into sci-fi adventure with The Fifth Element and laugh through the mayhem in Tropic Thunder.
What is going on here?
All the thrills, all for free. Pluto TV. Stream now. Pay never.